thank you for joining me. It's good seeing you, my friend.
Oh, Jeff, I'm glad to be here. It's always fun discussing whiskey and tasting with you. And I'm really excited today because I understand Land Run Distillery is being built on the family ranch.
That's true. My great-grandfather, Henry Ingle King, established the ranch during the Land Run Act of 1893. That's why our name is Land Run Distillery and Land Run Whiskey. We want to honor our ancestor and all of the determined settlers that experienced a land run and cut a new life for their families.
Wow, what a heritage and something to be proud of. You know, generally speaking, I think people think of whiskey, they think of Kentucky and whiskey. How will you make a premium whiskey in northern Oklahoma?
Well, that goes back to the basics of whiskey. You need a great raw material or the fantastic grain. You need lime-rich or calcium-rich water. You need a fantastic process, and you need erratic weather for aging the barrels.
So I kind of always understood that aging in whiskey is really the primary thing. But from what you just said with those basics, you started out with a high-quality grain. Where will Land Run get its grain?
Well, the good news is that ever since my great-grandfather settled the land, it has been an active cattle ranch and grain farm. So my grandfather, Carl Ingle King, expanded the ranch and established the Bar E brand, thus the Bar E Ranch. But since its inception, it's grown wheat and barley and maize, and it grows an off-season crop of soybeans. So we have the availability to grain right there on our land that we will grow for our own whiskey. The quality of the grain comes into the process because we're right in the middle of an area of the world that's known as the breadbasket of the world. This region starts in central Texas, expands through the Dakotas, then east through Indiana and Illinois, and it's known worldwide for producing the finest grains. So we'll produce our own grains and move on from there.
So wow, over 100 years of growing your own grains, and you can be able to continue to control that process at Land Run. What is the next process in making a premium whiskey?
Yeah, once we have a quality raw material like the grain, the second step in the whiskey making process is water. Sounds very simple, but if you go back to Kentucky, who's known for making the best bourbon and some of the best whiskeys in the world, their water runs across layers of limestone through their creeks and rivers, and that's where they get their water. This is important because the limestone naturally removes metals like iron and manganese from the water, but it allows a lot of calcium into the water. The good news is that Land Run Distillery, sitting on the Bar E Ranch, sits on a whole strata of limestone and sits over a limestone aquifer. So Land Run Distillery, we're drilling wells into the aquifer and pumping the limestone water, and that's how we'll make our mash.
So you mentioned mash. What is it and how do you make it?
In simple terms, mash is like a oatmeal material because we're taking the milled grain that comes from our own ranch and we're putting it into the limestone water in 1,000-gallon cookers. And we heat that up, and during the heating process, it changes the carbohydrates in the grain into sugars. And the sugars are what the yeast will use to create the alcohol. So the mash process is the mixing of the grain with the water. And there's one other part that people really don't know about, but we add a malted grain into the system, and this keeps the oatmeal, for lack of a better term, in a consistency that we can work with it. It keeps it into a liquid form so we can move it from the cookers into the fermentation tanks into the stills.
All right, so take me back to the 4 basics you first started with. Tell me more about Land Run's process.
Yeah, it's good to keep me on track because I will talk about whiskey all night and run down rabbit holes all day long. But at Land Run Distillery, we are purchasing the highest quality equipment with state-of-the-art control systems. That's important because we can, batch after batch, control our times and temperature down to the second. And in this process, we'll be able to create the best mash and move that into fermentation tanks with the yeast. and this is important because in our fermentation, we control the temperature of the fermentation and the temperature of our fermentation room. By doing this, we get a very consistent product with a high alcohol per volume. And then after that, it moves into the still, again, another process where you control both your time and temperature.
So that process is quite extensive, and it's really very interesting. When does a whiskey make into the barrels?
Well, yeah, through the process, it seems like it takes a long time. But after distillation, which is the process of removing all of the grain and all of the bad parts of the whiskey from the beer, is what it's called in the whiskey industry, and we're only extracting the ethanol or the alcohol. Well, once that comes out of the still, then it will go into tanks, and then it is pumped into the barrels for aging.
So now you've produced the whiskey. Will Land Run only have a straight bourbon and a rye whiskey?
No, the good news is that although our basic products are bourbon and rye whiskeys, each of these individual segments of the market will have different labels. We'll be able to do a small batch elite because our 2-year, 2.5-year bourbon will be aged in 25-gallon barrels. And in the smaller barrels, the spirits will pick up a greater flavor and a greater color faster. We'll also have our first releases, which is a double oak, meaning we take it out of a 53-gallon barrel and then put it into a 25-gallon barrel. So it's going to be gaining different flavors and characteristics from each barrel, and then the charcoal that's inside the barrel will help filter that. We also will have a pecan finished bourbon and rye, and that will go into a pecan barrel, and we'll pick up some nutty flavors and a smoothness that you don't normally get in a normal straight bourbon or a straight rye. We'll continue to make our pecan whiskey, which is unique in the market, and a pecan liqueur.
Well, Jeff, here's to a premium friend and to Land Run Premium Whiskey.
Thank you. It's a premium whiskey rooted in tradition.
Yes, sir.